When the United States was bombed at Pearl Harbor, the world was shocked at how advanced and how bold the Japanese were. It soon became clear that the Japanese had an incredible and technologically advanced military. This was a sharp contrast from the essentially medieval Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan less than a century before. Since the mid-19th century, Japan underwent one of the quickest reformations in history, transforming its government, society, economy, and military from a medieval structure to that of a modern nation. So how did this reformation start? In 1853, a man named Matthew Perry, a Commodore in the American Navy, arrived in Japan with his fleet and pressured the Japanese into ending their centuries-long period of isolation, one of the sharpest turning points in history. Perry's arrival was a turning point in Japanese history, causing political, social, economic, and military changes that would transform Japan from a medieval state to a modern nation that was ready to challenge the greatest contemporary world powers in less than 100 years. Prior to the arrival of Commodore Perry, Japan was a feudal state under the control of the Tokugawa shogun, whose authority was derived from military strength. Japan had an emperor, but he was little more than a figurehead with no real power. Because the shogun ruled almost exclusively through intimidation and military might, he was fearful of new ideas that could undermine his authority. Since the 1600s, the shogunate had ordered Japanese ports closed to the outside world, allowing only limited trade with the Dutch because of this paranoia. With such little outside influence, the Tokugawa shogunate was able to keep power at the expense of falling behind in technology and in knowledge of the Western world. The United States and Japan had little knowledge of each other prior to the arrival of Commodore Perry. Most of their knowledge was inaccurate rumors. By the mid-1800s, the United States had developed a strong interest in Japan. After the Opium Wars, China had fallen to the Western powers, and India was dominated by Britain. Attempting to compete in a globalized economy, the United States wanted a foothold in East Asia. All that was left untouched by the European powers was Japan. In 1852, the president, Millard Fillmore, commissioned a voyage to Japan in order to engage in trade relations, and penned a letter to the emperor. Commodore Perry was chosen to lead an expedition to deliver this letter. Perry's arrival in Japan the following year would be a turning point in not only Japanese, but also world history. Fillmore's letter was delivered by Perry on July 14, 1853, when he stepped off of his steamship, something the Japanese had never seen before. He was backed by 1,000 men and 65 cannons, which frightened the Japanese into allowing him to meet a delegation of nobles and samurai on behalf of the shogun. He tried to negotiate a treaty and trade agreement through a Dutch interpreter, but failed, so he left, saying that they had a year to consider. When he returned in 1854, he sought to further intimidate the Japanese by bringing 18,000 men and over 100 mounted guns. It was made clear to the Japanese that while it could be profitable to trade with the Americans, refusing to do so would be very dangerous. This was accomplished by showing the Japanese things they had never seen before, such as revolvers, African Americans, steam engines, and telegraphs. It was made clear that it only took 18 days to reach Japan by boat, and that Perry's soldiers were only a small portion of the American army. The Japanese sent out a multitude of samurai and sumo wrestlers to be present when Perry and his crew arrived. Despite all this showboating, an important exchange in culture and technology began. The Japanese were left with trinkets of Western culture, which would be important in their modernization. The turning point of Commodore Perry's arrival had an immediate impact on Japanese society. The Convention of Kanagawa, the agreement Perry reached with the Japanese, called for fair treatment of castaways and, more importantly, opened certain ports, allowing trade with the United States and eventually the rest of the world. Foreigners began to interfere in the affairs of Japan, something its people found to be unnecessary and humiliating, causing unrest. By the early 1860s, the shogun Iemochi was finding it increasingly difficult to keep his citizens in line. Many believed Iemochi was weak and unable to deal with Perry and the foreigners, and wanted the emperor to take power. When the emperor died in late 1867, imperial loyalists pressured his 14-year-old son Mutsuhito into overthrowing the shogun. In response, the shogun sent his army to crush the rebels in Kyoto, but failed, starting the Boshin Civil War. The shogun's army mainly consisted of samurai who used outdated weaponry and tactics. The imperial army utilized Western weaponry, giving them an advantage. After a series of defeats, the shogun surrendered on May 18, 1869. The official transfer of sovereignty from the shogun to Mutsuhito, the Emperor Meiji, marked the end of the Tokugawa era, which had been in decline since the arrival of Perry. Japan was now ready for a new modern era, beginning with the Meiji Restoration. Despite owing his power to his subjects' dislike of the West, the Meiji Emperor did little to resist foreign influence. In fact, he embraced Western culture, thinking that if Japan became westernized, major world powers might look upon them as equals and would stop taking advantage of them. He changed the calendar from the one used by the East to the Western Gregorian calendar, and began to dress in the styles of the West. Many Japanese followed his example. Some in Japan were still frightened of the West, but they could not deny its success and wanted a share of it. Regardless of their xenophobia, Japanese society was well suited to adapt to Western style. Although much of traditional Tokugawa culture was discouraged and lost, the strong work ethic cultivated through this time carried on. When the Meiji government threw out their class system, many people who had previously been peasants moved to cities and started businesses, growing Japanese infrastructure. This was an era of individual opportunity. Companies that are still prominent today, such as Yamaha, Mitsubishi, and Nintendo, got breaks that allowed them to become internationally successful entities. Japan hired foreign engineers to train workers so that they could improve manufacturing, expanding their economy on an international level. By 1871, the Japanese feudal system had been disassembled, giving power to the central government rather than individual daimyo. Samurai lost their privileged position in society as a modern army based on conscription was created in 1873. The Japanese military implemented new technology from the West, although in the 1880s their military was still using bronze cannons and single-shot rifles. A national spirit emerged, uniting Japan by their desire to prove themselves to the rest of the world. They recognized that they were technologically far behind the Western powers and made it a priority to catch up and eventually surpass them. This desire to prove themselves to the world, starting with Perry, was the motive behind Japanese imperialism. Imperialism required a drive for military might, and in the 1880s Japan felt they were powerful enough to invade foreign lands and secure their own power. When China, weakened by the West, moved troops into Korea in 1894, the Japanese saw this as an excuse to attack, starting the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan's military had been borrowing ideas and technology from the West, allowing them to repeatedly defeat the Chinese in battle. A year later, the war ended, with Japan gaining a good deal of territory from China, including some control over Korea. During the course of the war, Japan built and upgraded coastal ports, bases, and arsenals, built a railroad, and improved roads. This connected all of Japan economically, and made it easier for troops and equipment to be rapidly moved to ports to be shipped overseas, necessary for future wars. Japan's quick and seemingly effortless war caught the West off guard. Shortly after, the Japanese instigated what would be known as the Russo-Japanese War. From 1904 through 1905, Japan fought Russia for control over Korea and Manchuria. The world saw Japan as capable of standing against major world powers, causing people to invest in Japanese businesses. Also, Russia lost interest in East Asia, which left Japan as the sole power in the region. The United States would become the new hypothetical enemy, and new strategies and technology were implemented to reflect this. In World War I, Japan led the Allies in capturing German island colonies in the Pacific, which they were allowed to keep, giving them better control over the Pacific theater. After World War I, Japan's young and fragile economy, heavily reliant on the US and its allies, was in jeopardy due to the West's anger at Japan's resumed war in China. The Japanese saw only one option: to attack the US.
So in a sense, Perry's visit inspired the Japanese speedy rise in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to become an international power. And that international power eventually clashed with the US.
Few moments in history have been as great a turning point as when Commodore Perry arrived in Japan, forcing Western culture upon its people. Despite how unwelcome it was, the seed took, and to this day many Asian countries refer to Japan as a Western power, not as one of the East. Perry himself didn't cause any change, but rather the threat of Western imperialism that he represented forced Japanese leaders to think about how they might adapt to the new world order. The turning point represented by Perry's arrival changed the course of Japan, turning it from an essentially medieval state to a modern industrialized nation who instigated several major wars, including World War II. Japan was revolutionized by Perry's arrival. and then the Japanese changed the world.